At 4:27 in the morning on May 19th, 1944, sonar operator John Williamson sat in the cramped sound room aboard the destroyer escort USS England, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening to something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive ping pattern, echoing back through the dark waters 60 miles north of the Admiralty Islands, was unmistakable. Contact, submarine, range 1,200 yards, bearing 095 degrees. Williamson had been tracking merchant ships and whale sounds for 3 weeks. His ears were trained to filter ocean noise, distinguish biologics from mechanics, separate friendly propeller signatures from hostile ones. This was hostile. The Doppler shift, the metallic resonance, the deliberate evasion pattern as the contact dove deeper, all confirmed what American intelligence had been predicting. Japanese submarines were moving through this area, heading south toward critical supply routes between Pearl Harbor and the forward bases supporting operations in New Guinea. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Williamson didn't know, what nobody aboard England knew that morning, was that his ship was about to begin the most devastating anti-submarine warfare patrol in naval history. Over the next 12 days, this single destroyer escort, a ship the Imperial Japanese Navy would have dismissed as inconsequential, would systematically destroy 6 Japanese submarines, 6 confirmed kills in 12 days, a record that has never been equaled by any ship in any navy in any war. The Japanese Naval General Staff had assumed their submarines were invisible hunters operating with impunity in waters too vast for American forces to effectively patrol. They had calculated that American destroyer escorts, mass-produced convoy defenders built in converted shipyards, lacked the training, equipment, and tactical sophistication to threaten Japan's elite submarine force. They had estimated that I-boat captains, trained for years in the demanding art of undersea warfare, would easily evade these hastily built subchasers crewed by reservists with months of training. They were catastrophically wrong, and by the time they understood the magnitude of their error, 6 submarines and nearly 500 highly trained submariners were dead on the Pacific floor. Victims of a weapon system they had fundamentally underestimated, and a crew they had never imagined could exist. USS England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, hull number DE-635. Commissioned on December 10, 1943. She displaced 1,400 tons, measured 306 feet long, carried a crew of 213 officers and enlisted men. Her armament was modest by fleet destroyer standards: 3 3-inch guns, 8 40mm anti-aircraft guns, depth charge racks, K-gun throwers for launching depth charges laterally, and most importantly for this story, a Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar mounted forward. The Hedgehog was revolutionary technology that Japanese intelligence had failed to adequately assess. Unlike conventional depth charges that had to be dropped over a suspected submarine position and detonated at preset depths, hoping the shockwave would rupture the pressure hull, the Hedgehog fired 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship. Each projectile weighed 65 pounds, contained 35 pounds of Torpex explosive, and only detonated on direct contact with a solid object like a submarine hull. This meant no explosions unless there was a hit, which solved a critical problem with conventional depth charge attacks. When depth charges exploded, they created massive turbulence and acoustic interference that made sonar useless for several minutes. The attacking ship was temporarily blind, unable to track whether the submarine had been damaged or was escaping, while sonar operators waited for the water to settle. The Hedgehog eliminated that problem entirely. If there was no explosion, the submarine had evaded, and sonar contact could be maintained continuously to adjust for the next attack. If there was an explosion, the submarine was dead. There was no middle ground. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized crash dives to extreme depth when under attack, relying on pressure hull strength to survive. Depth charge are patterns detonating above or around the boat. Captains were trained to go deep, go silent, and wait for the attacker to lose contact or exhaust their depth charge inventory. This tactic worked reasonably well against conventional depth charge attacks, where attackers were firing blind once the first pattern exploded and had limited ammunition for sustained attack. It was completely ineffective against hedgehog-equipped ships with patient, well-trained crews who could track submerged contacts continuously and make repeated attacks without losing sonar contact. The psychological dynamic was reversed. Instead of the submarine hiding in three-dimensional ocean space, forcing the surface ship to guess where it had gone, the submarine was trapped in a shrinking box, defined by the attacking ship's sonar cone, unable to escape, unable to hide, and faced with an attacker who could prosecute the contact indefinitely until the submarine made a fatal mistake or ran out of battery power. Lieutenant Commander Walden Lee Pendleton commanded USS England. Pendleton was 34 years old from Minden, Louisiana. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1932, spent the 1930s serving on battleships and cruisers, learning seamanship and ship handling through traditional surface Navy assignments. When war came, he transitioned to destroyer escorts, the unglamorous workhorses of convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare. Pendleton was methodical, patient, and deeply committed to training his crew to the highest possible standard. He understood that anti-submarine warfare was less about dramatic surface engagements and more about disciplined execution of complex procedures under sustained pressure. Sonar operators had to maintain contact through evasive maneuvers. The bridge team had to position the ship precisely for attack runs, despite the submarine's attempts to turn inside the destroyer escort's turning radius. The Hedgehog crew had to reload and prepare for repeated attacks, knowing that each attempt might be the one that killed 200 men trapped in a steel tube thousands of feet below them. England's crew had trained together for 6 months before deployment, running endless exercises off Hawaii, practicing attack approaches until every man could execute his role without conscious thought. They had fired practice hedgehog patterns at underwater targets, learning how ocean conditions affected projectile accuracy. They had drilled the sonar tracking against friendly submarines, playing the role of hostile contacts, developing the patience to maintain contact through aggressive, evasive maneuvers. By the time England deployed to the Southwest Pacific in April 1944, Pendleton believed his crew was ready for combat. He had no way of knowing they would face a test far beyond anything contemplated during training, a test that would require them to maintain peak performance day after day against an enemy that grew more desperate and dangerous with each passing encounter. The submarine Williamson, detected on May 19th, was I-16, a B-1 type submarine displacing 2,584 tons surfaced, 3,654 tons submerged. She was 356 feet long, carried a crew of 94, and was armed with 8 torpedo tubes and a 5.55-inch deck gun. She had been commissioned in March 1940, had participated in operations throughout the Pacific, and was now attempting to transit south toward operational areas off the Solomon Islands. I-16's captain, Commander Yoshitaka Takeuchi, was an experienced officer who had commanded the submarine since January 1943. He had survived multiple depth charge attacks during previous patrols, had learned to read the attack patterns of American destroyers, and believed he understood how to evade subchasers through aggressive depth changes and course alterations that would break sonar contact. What Takeuchi didn't understand was that the ship now tracking him was equipped with technology and crewed by personnel who operated on completely different assumptions about what was possible in anti-submarine warfare. He assumed that once he dove below 300 feet and went silent, the attacking ship would lose contact and begin a time-consuming search pattern. He assumed that any depth charge attack would create enough turbulence to let him escape during the confusion. He assumed he was fighting the same kind of enemy he had faced before. He was wrong on every count, and those false assumptions would kill him and his entire crew within the next hour. Pendleton ordered general quarters at 4:30 a.m. Within minutes, the entire crew was at battle stations. The Hedgehog team prepared their weapon. Sonar operators refined their tracking solution. The bridge team plotted an attack approach that would bring England directly over the submarine's position at optimal firing range. I-16 dove to 400 feet, turned hard to port, increased speed to attempt to break contact. Williamson maintained sonar lock through the entire maneuver, his voice calm and steady as he called out bearing and range changes to the bridge. Pendleton adjusted course to compensate, keeping England positioned for an optimal attack run. At 4:53 a.m., England reached firing position. Pendleton gave the order. The Hedgehog mortar fired with a distinctive whooshing sound as 24 projectiles arced forward in their elliptical pattern, spreading out as they flew, entering the water 250 yards ahead of the ship. The crew waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, then the ocean erupted. A massive underwater explosion sent a column of water rocketing upward, followed by secondary detonations as I-16's forward battery compartment ruptured and seawater flooded into spaces where electrical systems discharged their stored energy. The submarine's pressure hull had been breached. At 400 feet depth, the ocean pressure was over 170 pounds per square inch. Once the hull integrity was compromised, the submarine flooded in seconds. Debris began surfacing. Wood fragments, cork insulation, oil, creating a spreading slick that confirmed the kill. 94 men died instantly or in the terrifying seconds as their submarine imploded around them. Commander Takeuchi never knew what killed him. The Hedgehog projectile that struck I-16's forward hull exploded on contact, and the submarine ceased to exist as a functional vessel in less time than it takes to draw a breath. England's crew celebrated briefly, then returned to patrol. 1 submarine destroyed. It was a significant achievement. Destroyer escorts spent weeks hunting contacts that turned out to be biologics or false echoes. Scoring a confirmed kill on the first patrol action was remarkable. But nobody aboard England imagined it was just the beginning. The tactical situation that brought England into contact with I-16 was the result of American signals intelligence achieving one of its most significant breakthroughs of the Pacific War. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor and Station Belconnen in Australia had been intercepting and partially decrypting Japanese naval communications since before the war. By mid-1944, American codebreakers could read substantial portions of Japanese operational traffic, including movement orders for submarine forces. In late April 1944, intelligence analysts identified a Japanese submarine picket line being established along a north-south axis from the Caroline Islands toward the Admiralty Islands in New Guinea. The purpose was to provide early warning of American fleet movements and interdict supply routes, supporting General Douglas MacArthur's advance along the New Guinea coast toward the Philippines. 7 submarines were assigned to this picket line: I-16, RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, RO-108, RO-105, and I-126. Intelligence provided probable transit routes, operational areas, and estimated arrival times. This information went to Commander Task Group 925, an anti-submarine warfare group built around 3 destroyer escorts: USS England, USS George, and USS Raby. The task group commander decided on a strategy called barrier patrol. Instead of trying to search vast ocean areas hoping to stumble across submarines, the 3 ships would position themselves along the expected transit route and wait for submarines to come to them. It was submarine hunting as strategic interception rather than tactical search. The approach required accurate intelligence, patient execution, and highly skilled sonar operators who could detect contacts at maximum range and maintain tracking through evasive maneuvers. 3 days after sinking I-16, England's sonar detected another contact, RO-106, a smaller coastal submarine displacing 696 tons surfaced, 782 tons submerged. She was 180 feet long, carried a crew of 38, and was attempting to reach her assigned patrol station when she encountered the barrier patrol. The engagement followed the same pattern as the first kill: detection at long range, careful tracking as the submarine attempted evasion, methodical approach to firing position, hedgehog attack. RO-106's captain tried everything in the tactical manual. He went deep, changed course repeatedly, reduced speed to minimal propeller noise. Nothing worked. England's sonar maintained contact throughout the entire approach. At 11:41 a.m. on May 22nd, hedgehog projectiles struck RO-106's pressure hull. The submarine sank with all hands. 38 more men dead, 2 submarines destroyed in 3 days. The crew was beginning to realize they were part of something extraordinary. Anti-submarine warfare was typically a frustrating mission of endless searches and rare contacts. England was encountering submarines with regularity that seemed impossible. The intelligence was that good. The barrier patrol strategy was that effective. And England's crew was executing with precision that gave submarines no chance to escape once detected. The next contact came on May 23rd. RO-104, another coastal submarine, identical in specifications to RO-106. Same displacement, same crew size, same armament, different captain making the same mistakes against an opponent that had already perfected its kill technique. RO-104's captain had not been warned about England because communications security prevented Japanese naval headquarters from broadcasting alerts that would reveal their codes had been compromised. He knew abstractly that submarines were operating in dangerous waters. He didn't know that 2 boats had already been destroyed in this exact area by a single ship that was still hunting. The engagement lasted 27 minutes from initial detection to final hedgehog attack. RO-104 died at 8:37 p.m. Her hull ruptured by contact-fused projectiles that gave her crew no warning and no chance. 38 more men joined their comrades on the ocean floor. 3 submarines in 5 days. England's kill rate was unprecedented in anti-submarine warfare. The crew was exhausted from maintaining continuous alert status, running repeated attack approaches, reloading weapons, processing endless sonar contacts to separate actual submarines from false returns. But they were also supremely confident. They had developed a rhythm, a procedural flow that turned complex tactical problems into mechanical execution. Sonar detected targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, giving adequate time to analyze contact characteristics and determine if the target was hostile. The bridge team positioned the ship for attack runs with precision that placed England in optimal firing position on the first approach nearly every time. The hedgehog crew could reload and prepare for follow-up attacks in minutes if the first pattern missed. Every system was functioning at the peak efficiency. Every man understood his role completely. The ship had become a highly refined killing machine, specifically optimized for one mission: finding Japanese submarines and destroying them before they could threaten American operations. Commander Takeuchi, aboard I-16, had never had time to transmit a contact report before his submarine died. The same was true for RO-106 and RO-104. Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo had no idea that 3 submarines had been destroyed. They knew the boats were assigned to picket line duty. They knew approximate operational areas. They expected periodic position reports and operational updates. When those reports failed to arrive on schedule, headquarters initially assumed communications difficulties or radio silence to avoid detection. The Imperial Japanese Navy submarine force was built around the concept of elite, individually operated boats conducting independent operations. Doctrine emphasized captain's initiative, radio silence to avoid direction finding, and minimal communications that might reveal operational patterns. This approach worked well for offensive patrols where submarines hunted independently. It was disastrous when submarines started disappearing without warning because headquarters had no immediate way to determine what was happening or where the threat was located. By May 24th, 3 submarines were overdue for scheduled communications checks. Staff officers in Tokyo began reviewing transit routes, considering whether weather conditions might have delayed arrivals at patrol stations, wondering if American anti-submarine patrols had become more effective than expected. But they had no concrete information and no way to confirm what had happened to the missing boats. The I-boats and RO boats operating in the Southwest Pacific were equipped with long-range radio equipment capable of reaching Tokyo from operational areas, but radio transmissions revealed submarine positions to Allied direction-finding networks. Captains were trained to maintain radio silence, except for essential communications. The standing orders emphasized that operational security was more important than maintaining regular contact with headquarters. This doctrine made perfect sense when submarines were successfully conducting their missions and returning safely to base. It became a catastrophic vulnerability when submarines started dying so quickly that they never had opportunity to report contact with the enemy before being destroyed. Japanese submarine doctrine had no answer for the kind of systematic destruction England was inflicting. The tactical manual assumed that depth charge attacks would be survivable through crash dives and evasive maneuvers. Nobody had written doctrine for how to survive a patient, highly skilled opponent with unlimited time, perfect sonar tracking, and a weapon that only exploded on direct hits. The assumptions built into Japanese training were being invalidated by technological and tactical innovations their intelligence services had failed to adequately assess. Hedgehog was known to Japanese naval intelligence as a new American anti-submarine weapon. Reports existed describing the basic operating principle, but theoretical knowledge of a weapon system is completely different from understanding how effective that weapon becomes when deployed by expertly trained crews executing optimized tactics against an opponent whose doctrine was designed to counter entirely different threats. On May 24th, England, George, and Raby received new intelligence. Another submarine, RO-116, was expected to transit through the patrol area within the next 48 hours. The three destroyer escorts adjusted their barrier patrol pattern, positioning themselves along the most probable approach route based on decoded Japanese movement orders. The crews were tired. They had been at sea for weeks, maintaining continuous alert status, running endless sonar searches in tropical heat that turned the ships into floating ovens. Sleep came in brief intervals between watches. Meals were eaten standing up or at battle stations. The physical exhaustion was compounded by psychological stress of knowing that any sonar contact might be the next submarine, that any mistake in tracking or attack execution might let target escape, but there was also pride in what they were accomplishing. 3 confirmed kills represented more submarines destroyed by a single ship than most destroyer escorts achieved in months or even years of patrol duty. The crew understood they were part of something exceptional, a perfect convergence of intelligence, tactics, technology, and skill that was producing results far beyond normal expectations. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton gathered his officers on the evening of May 24th for a brief meeting in the wardroom. He wanted to ensure everyone understood the importance of maintaining their edge despite fatigue. Submarine hunting required sustained concentration. One moment of inattention, one failed equipment check, one procedural error could mean the difference between killing a submarine and letting it escape to potentially sink Allied ships later. The officers understood. They returned to their stations and passed the message to their enlisted personnel: stay sharp, stay focused. The next contact could come at any time. It came at dawn on May 26th. Sonar operator Williamson, now approaching 72 hours with minimal sleep, detected a contact at 0600 hours. Range 2,300 yards, bearing 147 degrees. The signature matched previous submarine contacts. Probable hostile. RO-116 had arrived on schedule exactly where intelligence predicted. RO-116's captain, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Koizumi, was an experienced officer who had survived multiple war patrols. He was cautious, disciplined, and thoroughly trained in submarine tactics that had served the Imperial Japanese Navy well throughout the war. When his sonar operator reported propeller sounds, indicating surface ships in the area, Koizumi ordered a crash dive to 350 feet and reduced speed to minimize acoustic signature. The tactic had worked before against American destroyers whose sonar capabilities were less sophisticated and whose crews were less persistent in prosecuting marginal contacts. It failed completely against England. Williamson maintained the solid sonar contact through Koizumi's entire evasion sequence. The bearing changes, speed variations, depth changes, were tracked continuously as Pendleton maneuvered England into attack position. At 06:43 a.m., England fired her Hedgehog. The pattern struck RO-116's hull with devastating effect. Multiple projectiles hit simultaneously, rupturing the pressure hull in several locations. The submarine imploded at depth, her compartments flooding instantly, killing all 38 crew members before they could react. Debris and oil surfaced within minutes. 4 submarines destroyed, 4 attacks, 4 kills, perfect efficiency. But there was no time for celebration. Intelligence reported that 3 more submarines were approaching the patrol area. RO-108, RO-105, and I-176 were all expected within the next week, following the same transit routes, heading for the same operational areas, walking directly into the killing zone that England and her consorts had established. The Japanese submarine command still had no idea what was happening. 4 boats were now missing. 4 separate crews had failed to report arrival at assigned stations, failed to acknowledge routine communications checks, simply vanished. Staff officers in Tokyo were becoming increasingly concerned, but they still lacked concrete information about what had happened or where the threat was located. The submarines had been ordered to maintain radio silence during transit to avoid detection by Allied direction-finding networks. This meant headquarters had no position data more recent than the boats' departure reports from their forward bases in the Caroline Islands. Without knowing where the submarines had disappeared, headquarters could not warn other boats about specific danger areas or adjust transit routes to avoid whatever threat had destroyed the missing vessels. The operational security measures that protected submarines from radio intercept were now preventing the submarine force from responding to a systematic threat that was destroying boats faster than Japanese intelligence could even confirm they were under attack. It was a catastrophic failure of information flow at the operational level, enabled by doctrine that prioritized individual boat security over force-level awareness. On May 30th, sonar detected another contact. RO-108, a K-6 class submarine, displacing 525 tons surfaced, 654 tons submerged. She was 154 feet long, carried a crew of 40, and was equipped with 4 torpedo tubes. She was smaller and slower than the B-1 type boats like I-16, but she was still a capable warship crewed by trained submariners who understood their profession. RO-108's captain made the same fundamental mistake all the previous submarine commanders had made. He assumed that crash diving and going silent would break contact with the surface ships tracking him. He assumed that American destroyer escorts operated with the same limitations Japanese planners had built into their threat assessments. He assumed he was fighting an enemy that followed predictable patterns. England's crew had now refined their kill sequence to near perfection. Detection, tracking, approach, and attack flowed seamlessly from one phase to the next. Every man knew exactly what to do, exactly when to do it, exactly how his actions fitted into the larger tactical picture. They were no longer thinking through procedures. They were executing through muscle memory and practiced coordination. At 11:25 p.m. on May 30th, Hedgehog projectiles struck RO-108. The explosion was massive, indicating the projectiles had probably hit near the submarine's battery compartment where seawater contact with battery acid created additional explosive energy. The submarine sank immediately. With all hands, 40 more men dead, 5 submarines destroyed in 11 days. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The kill rate was beyond anything in anti-submarine warfare history. England had now destroyed more submarines in less than 2 weeks than most destroyer escorts destroyed in their entire wartime service. The crew was exhausted to the point of physical breakdown, operating on adrenaline and determination and the knowledge that they were accomplishing something that would be remembered long after the war ended. But intelligence indicated two more submarines were still approaching. RO-105 and I-16 were expected within the next 48 to 72 hours. The hunt would continue until every submarine on the picket line had been accounted for, either destroyed or confirmed to have escaped the patrol area. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized that I-boats and RO boats were valuable strategic assets that should not be risked unnecessarily. Each submarine represented months of construction time, extensive resources that Japan's strained industrial base could barely afford, and most importantly, highly trained crews that were effectively irreplaceable given Japan's limited training capacity. Losing one submarine was acceptable combat attrition. Losing two submarines in the same operational area indicated a localized threat that could be avoided through route adjustments. Losing 5 submarines in less than 2 weeks represented a catastrophic failure that should have triggered immediate operational changes and urgent investigation of what was destroying boats so efficiently. But headquarters in Tokyo still could not confirm what had happened because none of the submarines had survived long enough to transmit distress signals or combat reports. The boats were simply gone, disappeared into an operational area that seemed to have become a death trap for reasons nobody in the Japanese submarine command could explain or even properly investigate, given the limitations of their intelligence collection. Commander Hideo Kojima commanded RO-105, another K-6 class submarine identical in specifications to RO-108. Kojima was aware that communications from several submarines on picket line duty had ceased, but he had not been told those boats were presumed lost. The operational security protocols that governed Japanese submarine communications prevented headquarters from broadcasting warnings that might compromise codes or reveal intelligence about Allied capabilities. Kojima knew, in general terms, that anti-submarine warfare in the Southwest Pacific had become more dangerous. American destroyer escorts were more numerous, better equipped, and more aggressively employed than earlier in the war, but he did not know that 5 submarines had already been destroyed in the exact area he was now entering, or that the ship responsible for those kills was still hunting. On May 31st at 05:13 a.m., Kojima's sonar operator reported surface ship contacts ahead. Kojima ordered a crash dive, turned to a new course, and went deep, executing exactly the same evasion sequence that had already failed 5 times against England's systematic approach. The engagement lasted 31 minutes, from initial detection to final attack. Kojima tried everything his training had taught him. He varied depth between 300 and 450 feet. He changed course every few minutes to break the geometric solution the attacking ship needed for accurate weapons employment. He reduced speed to absolute minimum to decrease his acoustic signature. England's sonar operators tracked every move. Pendleton adjusted course and speed to maintain optimal attack position. At 05:44 a.m., the Hedgehog fired. The pattern entered the water ahead of England's bow, the 24 projectiles spreading in their elliptical dispersion as they sank toward the submarine, maneuvering desperately 400 feet below. 2 projectiles struck RO-105's pressure hull nearly simultaneously. The explosions ruptured the hull in 2 locations. The submarine's stern section flooded first, sending the boat into a steep down angle that caused additional structural failure as water pressure exceeded design limits. The forward section flooded seconds later. 40 men died as their submarine imploded around them. 6 submarines destroyed in 12 days. England had achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. No ship before or since has destroyed 6 enemy submarines in such a short period. The crew was beyond exhausted, operating in a state of focused determination that pushed through physical limits through sheer will and professional pride. But there was still one more submarine expected, I-176, another B-1 type boat, identical to I-16. Intelligence indicated she would enter the patrol area within 24 hours. The task group commander decided to give England's crew a brief respite. USS Raby would take the next contact if it occurred within her patrol sector. The decision reflected both practical necessity and organizational fairness. England's crew had been at battle stations almost continuously for 12 days. They needed rest before they reached the point where fatigue would cause mistakes. And the other ships in the task group deserved opportunity to participate in what had become the most successful anti-submarine patrol of the war. On June 1st, Rabi's sonar detected I-176 entering the patrol area. The submarine was tracked for over an hour as Rabi maneuvered into attack position. At 12:37 p.m., Rabi fired her Hedgehog in what should have been a textbook attack approach with perfect firing solution. The pattern missed. All 24 projectiles entered the water, sank to depth, and passed harmlessly around I-176 without striking the hull. No explosions. The submarine evaded successfully. I-176's captain, Commander Katsumi Ota, had received the warning his acoustic sensors provided when the projectiles entered the water nearby. He now knew that American anti-submarine forces were using a forward-throwing weapon that preceded the attacking ship's arrival overhead. He adjusted his evasion tactics accordingly, turning hard and going deeper to throw off the attacking ship's firing solution. Rabi made 2 more attacks over the next hour. Both patterns missed. The submarine's evasive maneuvers, combined with Rabi's crew being less experienced than England's team at prosecuting contacts against aggressively maneuvering targets, meant that the firing solutions were slightly off each time. Slight errors at depth translated into misses measured in yards, and yards were enough to let the submarine survive. The task group commander made a decision. He ordered England to take over the attack. Pendleton brought his ship alongside Rabi, received the contact handoff, and began tracking I-176. The submarine was now fully alert, maneuvering aggressively, and benefiting from a captain who had survived 3 attack runs and learned from each one. This would not be an easy kill. Commander Ota was doing everything right. He was varying depth continuously between 300 and 500 feet. He was changing course every few minutes on unpredictable headings. He was alternating between periods of high-speed maneuvering to break contact and periods of minimal speed to reduce acoustic signature. He was using every tactic in the Japanese submarine doctrine manual. England's sonar operators maintained contact through the entire sequence. Williamson and his team had now tracked 6 submarines through similarly aggressive evasion patterns. They understood the rhythms, the patterns, the predictable elements, even in unpredictable maneuvering. They could anticipate course changes, predict depth variations, maintain solid tracking, even when the submarine seemed to disappear momentarily behind thermal layers or acoustic interference. Pendleton took his time. He positioned England carefully, waited for moments when the submarine's evasion pattern brought it into optimal firing geometry, and prepared for an attack that would have to be perfect because this target was far more alert than any previous contact. At 14:23 p.m., England fired. The Hedgehog pattern entered the water in perfect dispersion. The projectiles sank toward I-176, which was at 420 feet, attempting another depth change to evade what Ota knew was coming. The ocean erupted with multiple simultaneous explosions. At least 3 projectiles struck I-176's hull. The submarine's pressure hull catastrophically failed at depth. The boat imploded, her compartments flooding instantly, killing all 105 crew members in seconds. Debris field appeared on the surface within minutes, confirming the kill. 7 submarines destroyed, 6 by England alone. 1 by Rabi after England had successfully prosecuted the final attack. The patrol was over. The Japanese submarine picket line had been completely destroyed. Every boat assigned to that operational area was now on the bottom, with all hands lost. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. 7 submarines destroyed represented approximately 450 personnel killed. These were not conscripts or hastily trained reservists. These were professional submariners with years of training, men who represented enormous investment in time and resources that Japan could never replace, given the demands of the war across all branches of service. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Japanese submarine doctrine depended on having enough boats available to maintain persistent patrols across critical areas. Losing 7 submarines in 2 weeks created gaps in coverage that could not be filled without pulling boats from other operational areas, which would create gaps there. The psychological impact was equally significant. Submarine crews operate in an environment of controlled stress. They understand the risks. They accept that depth charge attacks are survivable if the captain makes correct decisions and the crew executes properly. But the destruction of an entire picket line with no survivors, no one escaping to report what had happened, created uncertainty that undermined confidence throughout the Japanese submarine force. Word spread through informal channels that boats were disappearing in the Southwest Pacific. Crews heading to operational areas knew abstractly that they might not return. But they expected that some boats would survive, that intelligence would be gathered, that tactical lessons would be learned and disseminated. The complete destruction of the picket line with 0 survivors suggested something had changed in anti-submarine warfare, that American capabilities had evolved beyond what Japanese doctrine could counter. When England returned to port at Manus Island on June 7th, the story of her patrol spread rapidly through the fleet. 7 submarines destroyed in 3 weeks, 6 confirmed kills by a single ship in 12 days. The achievement was unprecedented. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, sent a message to Pendleton and his crew that became famous throughout the Navy. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. The crew received the Navy Unit Commendation, one of the highest awards that could be given to an entire ship. Pendleton received the Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Every crew member received personal commendations recognizing their contribution to what the citation called the most successful anti-submarine warfare patrol in naval history. But the most important recognition came from the professional anti-submarine warfare community, who understood exactly how difficult it was to accomplish what England had done. Detecting submarines at range required exceptional sonar operators. Maintaining contact through aggressive evasion required skilled tracking and patient prosecution. Executing attacks with precision that produced 6 kills in 7 attempts required perfect coordination between sonar, bridge, and weapons crews operating under sustained stress. England's achievement was not luck, it was not accident. It was the result of systematic training, technological superiority properly employed, exceptional intelligence providing targeting information, and a crew that executed at the absolute highest level of professional competence for an extended period under combat conditions. The Japanese submarine force never recovered from the losses suffered during this period. The systematic destruction of the picket line forced operational changes that reduced effectiveness across all patrol areas. Submarine captains became more cautious, more defensive, more focused on survival than aggressive prosecution of targets. The psychological impact of knowing that entire boat crews had disappeared without warning created hesitation that showed in reduced effectiveness throughout the remaining months of the war. Japanese naval intelligence eventually pieced together what had happened through interrogation of prisoners taken from surface ships and analysis of American communications intercepts. They learned about Hedgehog, about improved sonar capabilities, about barrier patrol tactics that used decoded Japanese communications to position anti-submarine forces along predicted transit routes. But understanding what had happened did not provide solutions for how to counter it. Japanese submarines lacked the speed to outrun destroyer escorts once detected. They lacked the depth capability to dive below the reach of weapons systems that could attack to 600 feet or more. They lacked the battery capacity to sustain high-speed evasion long enough to escape determined pursuit. The technological and tactical advantages all favored the Americans, and those advantages were compounded by intelligence superiority that let American anti-submarine forces know where Japanese submarines would be before the submarines arrived. The combination was lethal. Japan had entered the war assuming its submarine force would operate with relative impunity against an opponent whose anti-submarine capabilities were limited and whose vast ocean areas made effective patrol coverage impossible. By mid-1944, that assumption was completely invalidated. American anti-submarine warfare had evolved from reactive convoy defense to proactive hunter-killer operations that systematically destroyed submarines in their transit routes before they could reach operational areas. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could find and kill submarines faster than they could be replaced. America had that capability. Japan did not. The story of USS England became legendary in the Navy, taught at the Naval Academy and at anti-submarine warfare schools as an example of what could be accomplished through perfect execution of complex tactical operations. The ship herself continued operating throughout the war, participating in additional patrols, though she never again achieved the remarkable success of May and June 1944. The mathematics of probability suggested that such perfect convergence of intelligence, opportunity, and execution could not be repeated. England had been in the right place at the right time, with the right crew against an opponent whose doctrine made them vulnerable to tactics they had no effective counter for. It was warfare at its most efficient and most deadly. On October 26, 1945, with the war already over, USS England was operating off Okinawa when a kamikaze aircraft struck her portside. The explosion killed 37 crew members and wounded 23 others. The ship was extensively damaged, but remained afloat. She was towed to port, but the damage was assessed as too severe to justify repair with the war ended. England was decommissioned on October the 15th, 1946, and sold for scrap the following year. The ship that had destroyed more enemy submarines than any vessel in naval history ended her service quietly, broken up for her metal value. Her physical existence ended even as her story became permanent part of naval legend. Commander Walden Pendleton survived the war and remained in the Navy, eventually reaching the rank of captain before retiring in 1957. He lived until 1977, giving interviews occasionally about England's patrol, but always emphasizing that the success belonged to the entire crew, not to any individual. In every interview, he credited his sonar operators, his bridge team, his weapons crews, everyone who contributed to making England the most successful anti-submarine warfare ship in history. John Williamson, the sonar operator who made the initial detection on May 19th that started the killing spree, served on England through the end of the war. He returned to civilian life in 1946, worked as an electrical technician, and rarely spoke about his wartime service except to close friends and family. He died in 1994 at age 71. His obituary mentioned that he had served on USS England during World War II, but did not detail his role in the ship's remarkable achievements. Most of England's crew returned to civilian life after the war, melting back into American society, carrying memories of 12 days in May and June 1944, when they had been part of something extraordinary. They had monthly reunion gatherings for several decades, meeting in different cities, sharing stories, remembering shipmates who hadn't made it home. The reunions grew smaller each year as age took its toll. The last known gathering was in 2003, with fewer than a dozen veterans attending. In 1960, the Navy commissioned a guided missile cruiser, CG-22, named USS England in honor of the destroyer escort and her remarkable patrol. The cruiser served until 1994, carrying forward the name and the legacy. When she was decommissioned, the Navy announced that the name England would be preserved for future use, ensuring that the memory of the most successful anti-submarine warfare ship in history would continue in the fleet. The Japanese perspective on England's patrol reveals how completely the systematic destruction of the submarine picket line disrupted operational planning. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, commanding the Sixth Fleet, which included all submarine forces, wrote after the war that the loss of 7 boats in such a short period to what appeared to be a single American anti-submarine group represented a catastrophic intelligence failure at multiple levels. Japanese submarine doctrine had been developed against assumptions about American capabilities that were years out of date by 1944. The tactics that worked against depth charge attacks in 1942 were completely ineffective against hedgehog-equipped ships with modern sonar and trained crews. But Japanese submarine training continued teaching those obsolete tactics because the feedback loop that should have identified tactical failures and disseminated new approaches was broken by the fact that submarines were being destroyed so completely that no one survived to report what had killed them. Miwa noted that if even one submarine from the picket line had escaped to report encountering an anti-submarine group with exceptional capabilities, headquarters could have adjusted routes, changed patrol areas, or implemented tactical modifications. But 0 survivors meant 0 intelligence about what had changed in American anti-submarine warfare. The boats simply disappeared, and the submarine force continued sending additional boats into the same operational area, following the same routes, using the same tactics until the entire picket line had been destroyed. The institutional failure extended beyond tactics to the broader question of whether Japan could sustain submarine operations against an opponent with overwhelming technological and numerical superiority in anti-submarine warfare. By mid-1944, American shipyards were producing destroyer escorts at rates that Japan could not match, even if it converted its entire surface fleet to anti-submarine work. American sonar technology was years ahead of Japanese capabilities. American signals intelligence was reading Japanese submarine movement orders in near real time. The balance of advantages was so completely one-sided that Japan's submarine force was essentially operating at a permanent strategic disadvantage that could only worsen as American capabilities continued to improve. Continuing submarine operations under such conditions meant accepting that boats would be lost faster than they could be replaced, that crews would die faster than training could produce new submariners, and that the entire submarine force would gradually be eroded through attrition until it ceased to be an effective fighting force. Admiral Miwa understood this reality by late 1944, but institutional pressures and strategic necessity required that submarine operations continue despite the unfavorable mathematics. Japan needed submarines to maintain any capability to interdict American supply lines and provide reconnaissance. Withdrawing submarines from operational areas would concede complete control of ocean spaces to American forces, which was strategically unacceptable, even when continued operations meant accepting heavy losses. The decision to continue submarine operations, despite overwhelming odds, reflected the broader strategic dilemma Japan faced throughout the last year of the war. Every branch of service was operating at permanent disadvantage against an opponent with superior resources, superior technology, and superior intelligence. Continuing the fight meant accepting losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. But surrender meant accepting total defeat. So the fight continued, with submarines and their crews paying the price for strategic decisions made at levels far above their pay grade. The story of USS England and her 12-day patrol is ultimately about asymmetric warfare where one side possesses advantages so overwhelming that combat outcomes become mathematically predetermined before any tactical engagement occurs. England's crew was skilled, determined, and exceptionally well trained. But their success was enabled by technological superiority in sonar and weapon systems, by intelligence superiority that positioned them exactly where submarines would transit, by numerical superiority that allowed multiple destroyer escorts to maintain barrier patrols across vast ocean areas. The Japanese submariners who died during that patrol were equally skilled, equally determined, equally well-trained within the context of their own system. They died because they were fighting an opponent they could not defeat using tactics that no longer worked against technology their doctrine had not accounted for. They died because intelligence failures at the strategic level meant they entered combat with false assumptions about American capabilities. They died because the mathematics of industrial production and technological development favored their opponents so completely that individual courage and tactical skill were insufficient to change outcomes that were determined by broader strategic realities. Wars are won by nations with superior resources, properly employed, superior technology properly developed, and superior intelligence properly utilized. Japan entered the war hoping that superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. By 1944, that hope had been proven false across every domain of warfare. The systematic destruction of the submarine picket line by USS England was simply one particularly clear example of how technology, intelligence, and training combined to produce outcomes where one side's advantages were so overwhelming that combat became execution rather than contest. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.